Yeah, so let's start with a round of introductions from, the top for me. So, Ryan, if you would like to just do a quick spiel about who you are, what the story that you write, and this this is a bit of a cop out, but maybe an interesting fact about yourself is the best thing that I can think of right now. Yeah,
Go around the room and say something interesting about yourselves. It's like
right.
a meeting from hell.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
That's all
It
good.
has to be done.
I work in cybersecurity. My name is Ryan English. I work in cybersecurity. I've been writing consistently for 10 or 11 years. My first novel was called Obstacles in a series called The Acts of Androcles that I finished up a couple years ago, and I'm currently writing The Land of Broken Roads, which is a boy and his dog story, except the boy is an ancient wizard and the dog is a giant psychic wolf pup. Yeah, I read a lot of fantasy mostly. I sing opera. Everyone tells me I have a voice for radio.
It's pretty
I
good.
think that's about
I
it. Yeah.
listen. All right, thank you. Next up, maybe we could have Scott.
All right. Hey guys.
Yes, to have two Scotts.
I'm Scott Warren. I've been writing for about 10 years as well. Sci-fi and fantasy mostly. Right now, my main things are my Big Goblin space program. So, an astronaut reincarnated into the body of a goblin king who uses his minions essentially to jumpstart the Apollo program on a fantasy world. And then War Horses, which is a sci-fi series about a company of mech mercenaries.
Lovely.
Yeah, in my day-to-day job, I work in the defense industry. I can't really talk too much about it, unfortunately. And I often get told that I have a face for radio.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Next up, we could have if we could have Chris introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. My name is Christopher Pauli, and I go by the name Dose, which is Japanese for Saturn, like the planet. I write quite a few series at the moment. It's Isekai Exorcist and Madman Apocalypse. I'm from Denmark, which I think everyone else here is American. Uh, but yeah, a fun fact about me, I guess I'm fluent, almost fluent in Japanese. Yeah, that's why it appears in all my stories. Uh,
Yeah. All
um,
right. Awesome. Thank you. Alec, if you would like to introduce yourself next.
Hi, I'm Alec Lowndes. I'm currently, or I finished writing my series Waif, which is about a young woman in a sort of fantasy setting who, in a world in which everyone can do magic, she really can't do it. And you sort of, over time, find out why. And System Decay, Terminal Gene, which is should be very familiar for anyone who's read Blame. It's very Blame inspired.
The
Uh,
manga, right?
yeah, the manga.
Yeah, manga.
I used to be a software engineer, but now I just take care of my son and write.
It's good combination of things to do. Oh, yeah. Chris just showed us the manga. All right, thank you so much. I do recommend reading the manga if you guys have time. It's a very interesting. I'm a big manga nerd in addition to books, so it's great body of work. Thank you, Alec. If next up, Zachary Scott.
Hi, I'm Zach, and I write Level One God. It's just like your standard lit RPG fantasy hybrid, and I've only been doing lit RPG like 4 or 5 months, and then I guess a fun fact would be before this, I wrote in another genre, so I've been writing full time for about 8 or 9 years. That's about it.
Awesome. Yeah, we were just briefly speaking about, Scott Warren is also about to make a transition to writing full time, and I think that's great. So, um,
Nice.
yeah, thank you so much. Next up, Thomas, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Okay, so I'm Thomas McEntee. In my day job, I work as a research data scientist on the medical side of UNC. My recent history, I've been writing nonfiction and had my first nonfiction book out, I guess, a year or two ago now. and then recently started putting out fantasy. I'd always intended to be a science fiction and fantasy writer in my retirement career, and I had a spot between jobs when I had enough time to get things off the ground. So I write Accidental War Mage, and my current project, just in process of being out on Royal Road, is The Duke's Decision. Next up on deck is going to be a project that tentatively is titled Son of the Dragon.
Okay. Thank you. Thomas also has an interesting blog series on, I believe, like the last one I read was about warships, different warships.
Yeah. My nonfiction writing, the book I have out is titled Graduating from the Electoral College, but I like writing about all kinds of little odds and ends, just all over the place. I love learning things and figuring things out and writing about them. So
Yeah, I'm sure. I think everyone has a lot of things that I would love. I mean, if you guys would like to check out afterwards, including their web fictions. And speaking of web fictions, I think we have a lot of, experience in the room. I think collectively 50 to 60 years of writing experience together, maybe. So I would love for us to get into some general writing tips that you guys might have, or just quick little blurbs that you guys might like to share about a topic on writing. So if maybe we can start with just maybe the most interesting and most pivotal, which is the main character and character development. So how do you approach creating relatable characters in a genre as expansive as web fiction? If maybe we can keep kind of like the same order. And again, if you guys would like to pass, especially as we get into more niche topics about genres, feel free to take a pass. But Ryan, how do you approach creating relatable characters in the web fiction genre?
Acting really professional here. All right. So I kind of just start with a vibe, basically. Just a vibe, a mental image of something that I think is really cool. So for the Land of Broken Roads, it was a little boy riding a giant wolf.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just kind of think like, okay, who are these people and what are they doing here? And I kind of start working on backstory, and I end up with a lot of stuff about them all in my head before I get writing. But I think in terms of making relatable, I think it's more of a writing skill issue than a character development issue. How well are you able to convey their personality, and are you smart enough to have picked somebody that is sympathetic to your target audience? Because I mean, if you read like Korean manga, all their heroes are villains, like they're all dickheads. Like none of them want to do anything because it's the right thing to do. They've all got like a secret angle of like, this benefits me somehow.
Yes,
because they're just like completely unwilling to commit to being good, right? And so, like you have to understand like, who is my reader? Who am I going for? And how do I make this sympathetic to them? And then you make sure that that's like really vibrant on the page. And you can do that with like emotional, evocative language and description. You can do that by getting them in conversations where they'll have to say this about themselves, a bunch of stuff like that. But you're kind of trying to draw it out into the story in a way that makes them really just kind of vibrant and real.
All right. And I think that's a good place to stop for now. Thank you, by the way. Very informative. And I have nothing to say in the defense of Koreans. It's true. It's true.
I mean, I read a ton of it. I like it. It makes me vaguely nervous. I'm afraid you guys are going to take over the world with or something. I don't know. You're up to something with that.
No. I do have some slides prepared. So I'm gonna, during the break we're gonna have in about 40 minutes, I'm gonna go and write a defense. No, I'm kidding. All right. Thank you. Scott, what would you, Scott Warren, how do you approach creating relatable characters?
In terms of figuring out like who my main character is going to be, I kind of work backwards a little bit. Whenever I start a story, I usually have an end state in mind, and then I think about what kind of character, what kind of motivations would they have to constantly be working towards that end state as their goal. And I 100% agree with Ryan. on making a character relatable. You can make, the mark of a good author is being able to garner sympathy for any character by presenting their point of view in the narrative as understandable to the reader, making it so that the reader might not agree with what they're doing, but they can understand why that character feels they have to do what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that kind of relates back to, Goblin Space Program, where did you start out with the end state of what kind of person would want to reach the moon and like had an amputee astronaut?
Yeah, with Goblin Space Program, it's a little bit more cut and dry and straightforward there because, he was brought to another world. He was brought there for a reason, and a lot of the narrative is,
Mm,
basically showing the readers, hey, this is why this guy was chosen. It's because he's the one that would make these decisions. He's the one
mm,
that would, single-mindedly pursue this goal despite his circumstances.
right. And I thought that was an interesting twist on, the Japanese isekai genre of like kings summoning heroes. But
Mm-hmm.
in your story, it's a little no spoilers intended for, viewers now and in the future. But thank you for sharing. Okay, so next up, Chris, how do you approach creating relatable characters?
Well, I think like a lot of it comes down to like how the dialogue is written. So I tend to always put a lot of focus on that. I think for better or worse, I think in a lot of lit RPG, like subtlety is kind of hard to achieve. And especially for web novel release schedules, it kind of feels like sometimes like trying to do subtle character building is kind of frowned upon. You get a
Mm,
lot of comments about how oh, I wouldn't have done that if that was me. So I think my goal is always just to try and make the characters consistent because I feel like even if some people in the moment, reading them on Royal Road, for example, if they don't, how do you say, if they don't really understand the motivations, at least if they keep reading, they'll be able to look back and see if there is some kind of through line through it
mm,
all. And also, I just think like some things that I've read, I feel like the dialogue is always kind of the thing that holds the characters back from feeling real.
mm,
Um, but yeah, I also think like to make characters sympathetic, it doesn't even have to be that people can imagine themselves in that place, but more just that they understand the struggle and they see how the character grows over time, that sort of
mm.
thing.
Yeah, I love that.
Um,
Um,
like I will say though, like so
mm,
since I'm a I'm what you would call a pantser or a discovery writer. So I try to plan out the characters, but the story itself is kind of loose. So it's often just, the characters that decide where things go. Yeah.
Sounds good. It also sounds like it also ties into writing realistic dialogue would tie back into the technical ability of the author to write realistic dialogue. Or was that something that you were thinking about, or?
I don't know if it's technical ability per se, but I
Mm,
feel like for me, it's just more the characters have to be internally consistent because sometimes they're, like an author might have like a moment in mind where they're like, oh, then this guy will say this thing, and then this person will respond this thing, and it'll be really cool. But then when you go through it as a reader, it's like,
mm,
why would that person say that thing? And then
mm.
you start digging down into it, and you're like, okay, it's basically just like a pitch to to set up the batter to hit the ball or whatever.
Gotcha.
Um,
So putting yourself in the shoes of the character, not just having them say what you want to say
yeah,
because you think
exactly.
it's cool. Okay. All right, thank you. Alec, how do you approach writing relatable characters?
Well, like Chris, I'm also a pantser, and I find my sort of the way that I write my characters ends up being almost somewhat self-discovery as well, where I don't really set out with like a hard idea of what the characters are like, more like the germinating seed for what the story should be like, and then I sort of populate some characters into this world, but then through their own internal monologue or through their own internal dialogues to themselves and dialogues to other people, I sort of discover what they're like and what the effect of living in this world in the way that they've lived in it is like. Such as Willow in Waif, she has, which I didn't realize at first, like crushingly low self-esteem because essentially of her disability that she's been living with her entire life. And it wasn't a thing I realized at first. It was a thing that sort of presented itself in the writing. So I just hope that that ends up with realistic characters. One would hope that if they're coming out of my head, that they would be somewhat realistic.
Okay, thank you. Zach, how do you approach this character development, making them relatable?
Yeah. I think probably the biggest thing I try to think about is what each character wants, because you can kind of fall into a trap where you're just inserting someone you need in the moment. You know, you need a town guard, so you create a town guard. And I don't really like to get bogged down in a bunch of backstory and planning because I'm also a pantser. But I do like to just, sometimes you get an interesting character just because you give them a hidden desire that may not be obvious. And then if you do that with every little character you put into your book and you keep track of it, it's fun as a pantser too, because sometimes the characters prevent the story from going where you wanted it to go because you've got these people that in your mind are real and they all want different things. And then it also keeps them consistent, like Chris was mentioning, because you know they're doing these things because they want what they want. And so for me, it's like starting with that little nugget. And then the second, just quick thing, kind of piggybacking on the dialogue is I like to try to make everybody have, if I can, some slightly unique mannerism or, catchphrase, not really a catchphrase, but like patterns of speech. Even if it's kind of subtle, just, some people say the word like often, or some people pause before they speak a lot, a little character tics and stuff like that. So those are probably just the two things that I try to do. I'm not always succeeding, but it's the goal.
No, for sure. Yeah, definitely. You have to prevent, good authors prevent their personal voice from seeping into every character, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if you're not careful to give them a desire, you'll default to, they're always going to do what you would do. And so if you're always kind of checking it by that, I think it's a little fail safe.
Right. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Tom, how do you approach developing characters or then creating them in a relatable manner?
Okay, so my high level goal when I approach my characters is trying to make them completely consistent as much as I can. Like make this a real person. And the tools that I use for that, one that several other people have already mentioned, is I try to think a lot about what motivates them to do that action, or at least a lot relative to the character's presence. So some characters are not very present. I don't have to think very far of, oh, hey, this person is a security guard. It's their job to try and accomplish the mission of being a security guard. And then if they have a developing context where they've been pulled out of that context, now I have to step back and say, wait, okay, what's motivating them now? And to lean on that, I develop my characters very organically, usually. So, for example, Katya in Accidental War Mage literally just started as a background character of, oh, by the way, there's a sharpshooter with red hair in the background. I didn't actually plan on her being a very major part of the story, and that developed that way. So I do two things. One is that I try to glue traits onto characters organically as it would come up, like, oh, I need to describe this character, glue a physical trait to them. I have put this character in a new situation, glue a personality trait to them. This character acted this way. Why did they actually act that? What kind of person actually acts that way? What's their background? Glue a little family background on there. So I let my characters grow very organically. Sometimes I model them a little deliberately on pairs of people that I know, usually a pair of people who are from different contexts, and then I'll just start grabbing traits from one or the other person that I've put together in this pastiche and that gives me a little bit of freedom of choice, but also a little bit of consistency. And then third, it gives me a template that's not an actual person, but is my imagined melding of two distinct personalities. And something different can emerge from that, like a virtual child of two random friends.
A brainchild. Well, I mean, I believe that is a term. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, obviously, I do want to point out the term glued because that's in line with keeping things consistent once you make an addition. It's like an organic process, as you said, but it sounds like you also it's like a sculpting of some kind of characters that you do through your own processes. So thank you everybody for sharing. Hopefully, you guys can walk away with little bits and ideas, if not from this topic and the ensuing questions as well. I guess this is a good segue into plot and structure. And I know you guys were saying some of you guys are pantsers. Yeah, fun prank to do and when you're a child.
That's
Maybe
what I call
I shared a
myself.
little bit too much about myself. I'm sorry.
I'm not a pantser. I'm a gardener.
Okay, lovely. So who else is Panther versus Gardner, or however else you would like to categorize yourself? I believe we might want to hear from Scott.
Does anybody actually plot? Raise your hand. That's the question. So we have one.
I plot a little bit, but
A little bit.
you know the story is getting good when it gets away from you.
It's a good point.
Yeah, I'm about half, I think. Like there's some structures, I just don't know how they're connected.
And at a certain point, ideas for what happens next in the story will sort of like organically come. At least this happens to me. They just sort of like come to me all out of the blue. And I'm like, oh, so that's what happens next. Okay, I guess we're going to fill in the space between here and here, wherever this new idea came. But like I didn't specifically start writing the story with that plot beat in mind.
I would say I often start with the end of the story and sometimes with the beginning. And then, so I get a couple of ideas of where the big picture is, and then I start filling things in the middle. And there's a lot of improvisation with that. And I try to focus on building just a simulated world, kind of similar to what I've done when I'm a dungeon master in Dungeons and Dragons games, is build simulated world, have some possible ends in mind, usually more concrete for fiction than Dungeons and Dragons, but try to see what happens in the middle to make that happen.
That's kind of what I do. I have an idea of where the story's going to go, and I know where it started. I'm just not sure how it's going to get from A to B. So it'll eventually end up there, but most of what's in between I didn't think about until I wrote it.
Yeah, same here. Generally, the way I explain it to people is, once you've got a beginning and an ending, you've got basically a whole book, and all you have left to worry about is that pesky bit in the middle.
I used to try to make a really detailed plot, and then I kept finding that the characters wouldn't stick to it, kind of. So I just gave up, and yeah, that's why I don't do it for me.
So very rough or big picture, some beginning and end, or maybe some large plot events in the middle, but for the most part, it sounds like you guys give yourselves a lot of freedom to let your characters discover the world or run into adventures and whatnot. I guess one question that I had was, would you guys do it differently if you guys were writing traditional books, or do you guys feel that because web fiction is something that you guys have to publish so very, very consistently, it's a product of the medium?
I mean, I'm kind of an odd man out. I wasn't really planning on putting it on Royal Road in the first place, and certainly had never expected to publish it. I just wrote it because I thought it would be fun. It just seemed like a cool idea. My first trilogy didn't really go anywhere, even though I still think it's really good. So like I started out with a mindset of I'm just going to write some books and then I'm going to send them out to publishers, because I got like a friend who's an editor at Bain. Might be starting a new publishing company up here soon, but I knew some people for some other writing industry contacts, and I thought we'll just see how it goes. But then it started actually getting some traction. So I didn't really start with the intention of doing serial fiction Like I'm still writing books in my mind. So no, it would make no difference at all.
Yeah, I would say the current two stories that I put out on Royal Road are stories that I had novel-sized drafts of before I ever signed up for Royal Road. And maybe I'll adjust my approach now that I'm writing a project that I didn't start before Royal Road experience, the web serial experience. But I I kind of found a place to start putting out the projects that I had waiting in the deck.
I think my first story was similar to like Ryan and well, I guess Thomas as well, where I'd written like about half of it, I think, though, before I put it on Royal Road. But then, as people started interacting with it, I started, making some changes because the first book I put on Royal Road is really, really dark. It's like a villain-esque body horror. And I was finding a lot of commenters were self-inserting them into the main character's position, and it was kind of worrying. So I actually ended up adding in like a slow, almost like making this character human because he started off not having any emotions. So I think that kind of affected, like, I think the web novel release model kind of affected my like the story, the way that it was going to go. But I also think it made the story longer. But I think nowadays, like when I make a new story, I still try to keep it within like book formats because I think if it doesn't take off and I don't have like the drive to keep writing it for like 8 books or whatever, then I usually have enough for like a trilogy and I can end the story in a satisfying way without, leaving anyone feeling like they were abandoned or whatever. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Did anyone else have anything else to add about plots before we move into more progression fantasy and lit RPG elements? Or?
I could just add to what we were talking about. I feel like it's really different writing a web series than a book. And I'm kind of curious because in case anyone's already done a little bit of both in a lit RPG, because right now I'm still in the web serial only format. And it feels a little different because there's a lot of pressure to make every single chapter a self-contained, satisfying story. Mm-hmm. And then that pressure mounts as you interact and see feedback. And maybe you put out a chapter that's a little slower, and then you see the implied disappointment, or we didn't get anything good. And then that can maybe kind of get into your head and make you want to inject almost an artificial amount of tension and development in every chapter. And that's not really how I imagine a book. Like that's like a unique flavor of web serial that I'm getting used to. But I'm curious, for people who have done the web serial and then turned it into book format, did you feel like you went in and took that out? Did you change it? Did you leave it? You feel like that just made the book better? Or just kind of curious if anyone had thoughts on that too.
I actually do have one. So my newest story, Madman Apocalypse, is very much like web serial format, and it does have that problem that Zachary is talking about, where because there's like a comedy element, it felt like every episode had to have like kind of a big funny moment.
Yeah.
And I'm finding now that like I'm considering, I'm going through the first book to make it ready for publication. I'm finding that it's basically like nonstop the entire way through. So me and my editor are going through and finding places we can add in like calm moments to actually add some contrast. Because when you're releasing just 3 chapters a week or whatever, it's kind of like they always like want something every week, and otherwise they're kind of disappointed and they stop reading. So it is kind of a challenge for sure.
I know I was asking the question, but you mentioned the comedy, and I wrote romantic comedy before this. And so I ran into that exact thing with the comedy, feeling like how much is enough? And then is it going to be a disappointment if there's a chunk of the book where it gets serious? And at least for a different genre and for book length, I felt like people were okay with doses of it and then periods of slow. Like I never got anybody angry about that. So maybe for the book format, you can stress a little less about not having it every single chapter.
I definitely.
I mean, so I don't know if you're familiar with bog standard isekai, that's my little brother. He's the successful author in the family.
As of now.
Uh,
Soon, right? No, okay.
exactly. Yeah, he keeps telling me like once it goes to print, we'll see because it's a different audience. But he doesn't have like each chapter is a self-contained story with its own narrative arc. I think what he relies on, because I mean, if you're writing a story where you have to go from A to B, like there's gonna be travel sections, figuratively speaking, and literally in many cases. But I think what he did is he relied on having lots of color in his characters. Like he's got kind of a big cast and all of them have something going on. So even if the main character is just off like checking boxes to make the plot happen, in as he does that, he's encountering all this other stuff that's really like colorful and interesting and different from what we just saw. Or it's like developing characters that we thought were interesting in new ways. So I think like if you can get dialogue that brings people out really really well, if you can just find ways to have people interact even in basic interactions in ways that are like really evocative about interesting things about them, then you're going to satisfy the reader without having to like, what is the monster of the day? I haven't read your stuff. I don't mean to. I I hope you know what I'm intending. I'm
Yeah.
not saying you're doing
No, that's
monster of
really
the
helpful.
day,
Yeah.
but there's other tools. You don't have to worry about it having like a full story. I think if you have something like some nice meat with character interactions, if you don't have plot, or if you do have plot, some nice meaty plot, and then end with something that makes it feel like the story is progressing.
Mhm.
So readers always complain about hooks. They complain all the time if you end on a cliffhanger or a hook. But I do it every time anyway because screw them. They don't know what they want.
I mean, there's an element of that. Like, cliffhangers can be unsatisfying, but they do bring someone back for the next chapter because they got to know what happened.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
true.
it just leaves them feeling like things are going somewhere. Like it leaves them feeling that the story is still in motion.
Mm.
So it'll help cancel out that like nothing happened in this section.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's why I
Yeah,
watched 6 seasons of Lost.
It's
The way I kind of
great
think about
writing.
it in a chapter to chapter basis is that, if every chapter is its own self-contained three arc story to some degree, each chapter will give you the act three of the previous chapter and then an act one and two, and then save the act three for the start of the next chapter.
It's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah. Just to quickly share one thought that I had. So in the Korean web fiction world where, people post every day, 5, 6 days a week, they they do have certain tools, or in Chinese web fiction where people go through repetitive power leveling arcs, but then in between those, they add different beats. Like this is the recovery beat, this is the romance beat, this is the so it's not, I think, all the ideas that I've been hearing are great. Just wanted to provide an additional perspective where, in the more formulaic genres of Eastern web fiction. That's one way they approach, and they are masters of cliffhangers, right? And that actually, I've spent hundreds of dollars, reading Korean web fiction because of the hooks, because of the cliffhangers. I'm like, okay, like what happens next? But you also kind of know what to expect. And the truth of the matter is a lot of these readers, this genre is like a self-insert fantasy in a lot of ways. So I don't necessarily think that, repetitive power, that's why progression fantasy is so popular, right? Because people like the idea of playing with power. But so I think I will actually save some of the more fantasy RPG elements for the second half, and wrap up the next 10 minutes or so with just an open floor about how do you, so it is really hard. The observer effect is really hard to deal with. Readers, complaining real time about, character development, plots, stuff like that. So how do you guys keep consistent? How do you guys overcome like maybe anxiety, writer's block, and how do you balance audience feedback? And then anybody can take the floor first, but if I had to choose somebody, no, I'm kidding.
I
I
have
think Oh, sorry, Alec first.
Okay, I have a
Well,
really simple answer for this. If you go into the preferences on Royal Road and you go all the way down to the bottom, there's a thing that says, "Don't notify me when someone leaves a comment or rating on my story." You just click that, and now you don't have to worry about that ever again.
nice. Lovely, lovely. Is that something that everyone or people do? Other people do here?
I definitely don't do it. I do
Hmm.
think though, like sometimes you get some like really horrible comments. I've had my fair share of people that like legitimately got permabanned off the site for some of the stuff they did. I don't know why. I think maybe I attract them easily or something. But I think like the main thing for me at least that keeps me from like getting down in the dumps if I get like a bad review or some crazy negative comments is I focus on all the silent readers because if you look at your statistics, it's always like you have maybe a certain amount of average readers, and then you can tell how many people read like the latest chapter, and then you get a fraction of that as comments. So it's like, okay, there's some people that are really vocal, but most people they're reading and they're reading consistently. And I think that's like pretty motivating because I'm kind of the same person. Like I don't leave comments on everything I read. So and I also think it's important that you're enjoying the story you're telling. I think some people, especially the people where like they get like sudden instant success, they end up like forced to tell the story because it's popular or it's financially successful or whatever because of Patreon. And they end up like stuck in a story that maybe they just wrote on a whim, and then they end up not really enjoying what they're doing. And I think that ends up being the more important thing to avoid writer's block. So for me, I always focus on writing things that I enjoy writing, and taking breaks when it's necessary.
I just don't get negative comments very often, frankly.
Look at this
I
guy
weed
not
them
getting
all.
negative
I'll tell
comments.
you, I weed them all out by writing stuff that all the people that would do that are not interested in. I think that's what it is.
That may have been what I managed to do accidentally. I've had a small handful of negative comments, which you know, and I think one or two cases that I've actually gone to the trouble of reporting, and I do delete a few that are just negativity, but 95% of the commentary is positive, and I find it really inspiring to see that, like those. Maybe I should turn my notifications off because I see them on my writer dashboard anyway. Maybe I spent a little too much time checking them, but the seeing that stream, seeing those comments come in really helps motivate me of like, oh yeah, I got to get back in the seat and get some more writing time in and get some more of this written that people are excited about. Like, oh yeah, people are really excited about this character. I'm supposed to let's write their next scene. Maybe it's not in my next chapter, but it helps motivate me definitely.
So,
I'd say
oh, go
one
ahead.
thing, if you do struggle with the feedback influencing you, like I know I struggle with that. So the thing that I try to do when I go into looking at feedback is I try to go in with a purpose. Like I'm reading the feedback because I want to find out if this thing that I had flagged as a potential problem, was the pacing too slow here? Was it too fast? Was this character a little too off? And so I try to go in almost with like tunnel vision for that one thing, because if people are reading this story and the numbers are going good and it seems like they're engaged, then I'd rather just kind of like keep my blinders on and keep doing the things that are making most people like it. Because if you look deep enough, it feels like you can just find conflicting information and feedback on just about anything you're doing. Someone will tell you your dialogue is terrible. Someone will tell you it's great. Someone will say you're not funny. Someone will say you're hilarious. So you kind of, for me at least, I had to protect myself a little. And so my wife actually reads all my comments for me. And then if I get a really bad one, I've told her, I was like, just don't tell me about it. And then if I get good ones, she'll be like, you should read this one, and she'll just show it to me. So have someone flag or sift through your comments for you, maybe too, if you're fragile like I am.
One thing that
sorry, go ahead.
I really like to keep in mind when I do run into the negative comments, and when other people run into the negative comments, I try to always say this, like, you don't need everybody to love your work. It doesn't matter how many people hate it. It just matters how many people love it.
Yeah, writing for your fans and not your critics. Absolutely huge. I agree with that completely.
I mean, there's. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, personally, with me, I think a big part of avoiding some of those negative comments, there will always be conflicts, but managing reader expectations in your blurb and your front matter to make sure that the people who are looking for the kind of story you're writing are the ones finding it. Like with Goblin Space Program, it's essentially a story about a scientist, an explorer, and engineer who's very optimistic in a world that will reward that curiosity and that exploration. But I get not a lot of comments, but some comments saying like, why isn't he, immediately developing guns and taking over the world? It's not who he is. But I'm able to redirect those readers and say, hey, I have this other story with a main character on the evil spectrum that you might enjoy a lot more. As for, that being Two of Knaves, where the main character is inherently selfish, inherently standoffish, and in that world, it's treated as a virtue and it's treated as a method of survival. As far as negative comments go and negative reviews, I tend to have a pretty thick skin. I was in the military, so I've been yelled at a lot. I work in the defense industry where people will absolutely say just the meanest stuff. And if you want their respect, you got to be able to dish it out and take it, and not let people see that it's getting to you. And so it just kind of rolls off. With readers being a part of the story, or trying to offer suggestions as to what should come next, a lot of times it's just not feasible because I try and write 25 to 30 chapters in advance on a lot of books. So pretty much whatever is live on the website, there's almost an entire novel's worth of backlog already written. So a lot of times I just can't take that into consideration.
I think when you get negative comments, you got to be analytical about what it is that they're actually telling you. Because some of my comments, like what they're telling me is that they are themselves 14 years old. It's a comment of it, like a mild complaint of something that an older person wouldn't see the world that way. But a lot of times, like they're telling you that the way that you have presented it is inadequate, right? Or that you have hit something in the story that you're going in a direction that wasn't really thematically consistent with what you had previously, right? Or that some new element that you've introduced is not really well drawn enough. Like if it's a new character that people don't like, you haven't shown them saving a puppy, so to speak, right? They're not interesting yet. They're just there, right? Maybe it's starting to feel like an escort quest because we don't care about them. And so a lot of the times, like your negative comments are opportunities to find weaknesses in your writing that you would not otherwise detect, because we all have blinders on. Like we all know what we think it's supposed to be. We all know why we think the story has to go this way, why this character did that. It may not always be coming through, and sometimes it was a bad idea. Sometimes it was just not going to work, right? You just kind of have to be professional about it in that way. Mm-hmm. But sometimes they're telling you they're just not cool readers and you don't need to care about them. Or, sometimes that's what they're telling you.
I suppose. I want to, just add to that a little bit before we break off for a short break. It's really hard. I think people say in creative industries, I make music and stuff. It's hard to make something that everybody likes. That's the hardest thing. That's way harder to do. It's way harder to be mainstream than, and appeal to everybody on the spectrum rather than write for something that you really want to do. And it, that actually ends up filtering out a lot of the haters, so to speak, by if you, manage expectations, like Scott was saying, but also, I think there's a lot of great ideas here. I really strongly agree with, for example, the idea of, thick skin, being professional. This is a really lovely, industry that we're all here because we love stories, right? We love reading, we love writing. And myself, I do it poorly. I write poorly, but I still love to do it from time to time. But yeah, I think, it's a great perspectives were shared, and like to thank you all for spending the first half of this sharing your perspectives and expertise. And hopefully we can discuss more of it later down the line. But for now, let's take a break until 10 a.m. So just get some water or do whatever needs to be done. And I saw some petting of a cat earlier. So lovely stuff.
Yeah, anytime I'm on a video conference, she thinks she's a part of it.
Okay.